Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the launch of a new CDE report this morning. We're just going to wait one more minute as there are a lot of people still coming in, and then we'll start. Okay, I'm going to start. I'm going to give a short presentation which summarizes the essence of the report we are releasing today about the basic income grant. Now, South Africa is in the throes of a serious debate about implementing a basic income grant. The key issues around which there is debate are whether a BIG is affordable, whether it would deepen the crisis of sustainability of the country's public finances, whether it would lower the rate of economic growth and job creation, and whether it will help reduce poverty. And if it won't, what else can South Africa do? Now, a spectre haunts South Africa's public finances. The possible introduction of a basic income grant, which is a monthly cash transfer to all qualifying beneficiaries. The precise costs of a BIG are unclear. Proponents differ on some critical questions: how much the grant should be every month and how many people should receive it. The headlines of our report and my presentation today are these. I think we all agree on the facts. South Africa has terrifying levels of unemployment and poverty, and we have slow economic growth and slow employment growth. But in our view, a BIG large enough to impact on poverty with slow economic growth and possibly lead to a fiscal and financial crisis. Public spending in South Africa is already beyond our affordability. In our view, a large, new permanent spending commitment will make matters much worse. And if a BIG were to be implemented, there would almost certainly be fewer jobs in South Africa. Now, we've structured our report, and I will do the same for my presentation, around 6 critical questions. Why is South Africa thinking about a BIG today? What do the proponents say they want? Don't we already do a lot of redistribution? Can we afford a basic income grant? Will BIG help create growth, induce growth, more rapid economic growth? And what alternatives exist for reducing poverty? So let's start with the first issue. Why are we discussing a BIG now? There's no doubt that poverty in this country is worse than ever. In 2014, it was 55% of the population. And if you think of everything that's happened since then, we guesstimate it could be over 60% today, perhaps well over. Now, the key cause of poverty is South Africa's very high unemployment. We are probably the country with the developing country, the country with the highest unemployment rate around the world. Now, there's no income support for able-bodied working age adults. It was only during COVID we introduced the social relief of distress grant to poor individuals and through them to their households. And that has now been running for some 2 years, more or less. I think the other reasons we're discussing a big now is that many people in the ANC, perhaps government, have lost confidence in its economic approach to deliver jobs and deal with poverty. The numbers are now so vast, they don't really believe they know what to do. And a big is seen as essential by many political leaders for their electoral viability in the next elections. I think these hard realities help explain why a big has gained such traction in the last year or so. So what do the big's proponents want? Now, there is no single view, but there is agreement that for a big to make a real difference to poverty, a large number of people must be eligible, and the monthly grant must be a significant fraction of the current poverty line. So, for example, the Department of Social Development issued a report late last year which talked about immediately we should extend the SRD grant and then rapid increases in its value. By 2030, they would like all poor adults to receive 1,300 Rand per month, which would be about 400 billion Rand per annum that we have to find to pay for it. The Institute of Economic Justice, on the other hand, is talking about perhaps 800 Rand per month for all adults, or if not that, 1,250 Rand a month for those without employment. They identify the new taxes and the government savings that they say could pay for some 320 billion Rand every single year. So there are other proponents of the big with other variations on this, but we're talking more or less about somewhere between 200 and 300 billion Rand a year to pay for the kind of big that people are advocating. Now you might ask, doesn't the country already do a lot of redistribution? And the truth is, yes, we do. We pay some 18.4 million people some or other kind of grant, from old age pensions to disability to the child support grant. And I'm leaving out the SRD grant. If you look at the government's budget, what's called a social wage, which is all spending by government on delivery of services to poor households, which is social grants to basic education, RDP housing to healthcare. The social wage now consists of 52% of all spending. It's 60% of non-interest spending, and it exceeded 1 trillion Rand for the first time in the budget of 2020 to 21. It's about 1/6 of GDP. Now, it's important to note that when it comes to cash transfers, three times larger than the average for the developing world. And we far exceed the efforts of countries like Brazil or Russia or Botswana. Now, we have many programs aiming for redistribution, and they're of different kinds. The problem is a lot of this expenditure is inefficient and ineffective. Think of basic education, where enormous amounts go to paying for teachers and other people in the bureaucracy, but actually the impact that we have on the quality of millions of young people's learning is very, very weak. There are other programs that actually don't benefit poor households. Think of the rules governing transformation. And then there are some programs that are prone to misuse and abuse. The procurement rules are one of those. So the truth is, we have considerable spending, there's considerable existing redistribution, but too much is wasted or doesn't reach the poor. So in addition to all this expenditure, you have to ask yourself, can we afford a big? For CDE, the short answer is no. Our current spending is already unaffordable. Adding a large, permanent spending commitment every year will reinforce the unsustainable trajectory of fiscal policy. Now, this is not a controversial view. For at least the last 7 years, government's budget has been based on a commitment to do something about the large gap between tax revenues and spending that has resulted in a massive buildup of debt. Since 2008, government's debt has risen from about 26% of GDP to about 70%, a rise that is among the steepest in the world. And now our debt service costs exceed spending on education or healthcare and are squeezing out spending on other absolutely critical functions. So in our view, adding somewhere between 200 or even 400 billion a year will have significant negative impact. Well, what do we do about this? Some people have said, can we raise additional taxes in order to pay for a big? So the IEJ claims that a big can be funded by 330 billion in additional revenue every year. How do they find this money? Well, they want to tax more, they want wealth taxes, and they want some budget cuts in addition to those we already have. Doing all of that, they say, would have no impact on South Africa's debt in total. There are two big problems with this proposal. Firstly, can we really raise very substantial new revenues, even only 200 billion for a big? South Africa already has a high level of taxation and a weak economy. Intellidex in 2021 issued a report, and the Department of Social Development's expert panel also issued a report, and both these reports are highly critical of the IEJ tax proposal. There's a lot more detail summarizing those two reports' analysis of this tax proposal in our actual document. The second problem with this proposal is, have they considered the impact of this tax shock on South Africa's growth? Now, in 2015, the Davis Tax Committee established that a 45 billion increase in taxes would reduce economic output. The Department of Social Development's expert panel also concludes that higher taxes will slow growth, even after taking into account the increasing spending stimulus by poor households who receive a big. So overall, it seems to us that the IEJ assumes that imposing huge increases in taxes on a very small, probably declining tax base would have no effect on economic performance and prospects. This is simply not plausible. So we would argue this is an implausible proposal that would lower South Africa's growth and worsen our debt to GDP ratio. There's another proposal, which is, why don't we just print money to pay for a beg? Now, there is a theory called modern monetary theory, which essentially says in countries that borrow in their own currency, printing money won't cause inflation until real economic constraints are reached. For example, unemployment falls to zero. Now, similar to the raising taxes idea, it seems to us this massively underestimates the risks. Investors would see a radical change in Reserve Bank policy if we did this. And this would create a negative effect on all sorts of markets, financial markets, bond markets, and others. It would be a radical change of direction for the South African government and the Reserve Bank. In any event, it seems clear to us that South Africa has already hit the limits of some of its key capabilities. Think only of energy, never mind anything else. I was at a workshop a few months ago discussing a basic income grant where this proposal was a central feature of the discussion. And someone asked afterwards, after the presentation, they said, if it was so simple to just print money and give it to the poor who then spend it, and in that way we get growth, if it were this simple, how come we have so many poor people in the world? So in our view, inflation would be inevitable if we suddenly started printing large amounts of money, and this would further reduce growth. We know that the poor are more affected by inflation than anyone else, and higher inflation will only push the poor deeper into poverty. Now, there's some people who argue that a beg could help encourage, induce more rapid economic growth. And it seems to us that those who think this is possible ignore two realities. A fiscal stimulus will have no effect on the structural constraints on growth in the country. And this will turn increased spending into higher inflation. So new taxes, increased debt, higher inflation will, in our view, undoubtedly undermine growth. In fact, a beg will itself slow growth. This seems counterintuitive, and it's something that a beg's proponents generally refuse to consider. They try and argue in any which way they can that a beg would accelerate growth. In our view, it's much, much more likely that a beg will slow growth and possibly lead to economic crisis. Now, there is a proponent that would argue that a beg accompanied by economic reforms, that would promote growth. Now, CDE is absolutely in favor of structural reforms in South Africa, not just the president's rather limited list, but much more wholesale reforms than that. So the issue isn't should we introduce reforms in the country, but will a big accompanied by these reforms promote growth? Now let's assume bold reforms are adopted and implemented. In our view, the growth suppressing effects of a big would overwhelm the growth enhancing effects of the reforms. And reforms would struggle to gain traction as growth declined further. Now, the advocates of a big plus reforms, they never explain exactly how this will be sequenced. They seem to imply it would happen simultaneously. So from the 1st of July, we would start paying for a big for the identified population, enormous sums of money needed. And from the 1st of July, we would introduce a complex package of reforms. Now, some reforms can have quick effects, but many reforms, as we're discovering, take time to play their way through the economy and then result in increased tax revenues. So it's hard to imagine how you pay for the big without raising tax through the reform strategy. It seems to us that any extension of spending should be introduced after growth has been raised, and certainly not before. So the argument for a big goes like this. A big of, let's say at its least, 200 billion a year could have significant impact on household poverty. Let's say that's true. Seems true. But it could only have an impact on household poverty if its implementation did not undermine macroeconomic stability and if it did not dramatically slow the rate of economic growth and job creation. The BIG's advocates argue that the risks of this are somewhere between non-existent and manageable. CDE is arguing that their analyses are fatally flawed. The bottom line of our argument is that public spending in South Africa already exceeds the bounds of what is affordable. Adding a large new spending commitment will make matters worse. A big that is large enough to make a meaningful impact on poverty would at best, slow economic growth and jobs, and therefore tax revenue. At worst, this could lead to a fiscal and financial crisis. So in many respects, we would argue that a big is a mirage in South Africa in 2022. At first glance, it appears to offer some prospect of assisting the millions and millions of people living in poverty. But its costs, when combined with the already unsustainable level of public spending, will make it far harder to achieve a fast-growing economy with lots and lots more jobs. Now you will be asking, what is our sixth question? If you don't think a big will work, how do we deal with poverty in South Africa today? And there is terrible poverty and it's growing. So what are the alternatives for reducing poverty? The first thing to appreciate is that there are no easy answers to South Africa's socioeconomic challenges. There is no magical solution. We have made appalling policy choices for more than a decade. We've topped this off with a devastating pandemic and how we managed it. And this all means that we have dug ourselves into a very deep hole. Magical thinking about the benefits of a big that ignore the costs and the risks does more harm than good. But there are ways in which we can reduce poverty in South Africa, and we can do it to help millions and millions of people. This requires an approach to economic growth, to jobs, to redistribution, and to governance that is different from what we have today. So dealing with poverty in our country requires maximizing fast growth and taking all the hard decisions to do that. We've got to make that growth intensive and make those hard decisions. And then we have to simultaneously improve the effectiveness of all our existing redistribution. For all this to actually take place requires a very different approach to how we are governing the country and a real sense of urgency. We are in a national crisis. We cannot continue with government as usual, with doing the same things we've been doing up till now. To really make progress, South Africa needs a pathway back to sustainable public finances. We have to overcome the hard constraints on growth, power, skills, ports, railways. We need labor market reform, not wholesale, but carefully calibrated, selected reforms that will encourage employers to hire more workers and that will help in particular small businesses to grow and prosper and hire more workers. We need to lower the costs of doing business. That starts with crime, security, and everything else you can think of on that list, not just red tape. We have to address the collapse of governance. High levels of corruption and incompetence deter investment and raise the costs of doing business by making it hard to get regulatory approval. It's hard to see policy certainty in a market-friendly way. And unless we fix all of this, growth is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. A different perspective is required in the country. We have to move away from compensating people for their exclusion.
Apologies, everyone. It looks like Anne's having connectivity issues. If you'll please just bear with us for a minute. Anne, we lost you for a second there.
Hello, am I back? Am I back?
Yes, you are. You may continue.
I'm back, everybody. Hold on. Okay, so I'm not sure where I lost you all. I'm having terrible connection problems today. I'm arguing that a different perspective is required, a different lens altogether. We've got to move away from compensating people for their exclusion. And we think that significant progress on faster growth, jobs, and the impact of existing redistributive spending could draw millions of excluded people into the economy. It's way past time to focus much more attention on actually including people in our economic system and beyond.
Yeah, that's all I can see.
So let me conclude. In C's view, South Africa cannot afford a basic income grant. There is a big price for higher taxes. It's slower growth and less employment. A growth slowdown makes government spending even less affordable. This is terrible for the poor. We can't spend money as if growth has already accelerated. This could tip the country into deeper fiscal or even a financial crisis. The poor's prospects would be even worse in those circumstances. There is no shortcut to prosperity. There is no magical solution to poverty and unemployment. We have to focus on inclusion. And in our view, a big would be a reckless and losing gamble with history. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions from the media at this point. Everyone's rushed off to read our document. Carol Payton.
Hi there, Anne. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. You know, look, the problem with this is that I mean, I do agree that
I've lost Carol.
Have you?
Sorry, Carol, can you start again?
Okay.
I'm struggling a bit.
All right. Look, the difficulty here is that, you know, we've been beating this drum for a long time. Are you hearing me?
Sorry, can you start again? I missed you, but I can hear you now.
Okay. The problem is that we've been beating this drum for a long time, saying that, you know, the solution to our problems is growth. And it's clear that we can't get growth. We're unable to get growth. And there is no guarantee that these structural reforms, which are going to work through the economy very, very slowly, are going to create growth. So in that context,
you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, Carol, just give us a minute. We're trying another form of internet at this point. I can hear you and then you disappear.
Can others hear me?
Try again, Carol. Sorry about this. I can hear you now.
All right. Or otherwise, I'll just put it in the chat. Yeah, my question is, you know, we've been beating this drum for a long time, saying that, you know, the solution is growth. We just need growth, and we're going to dig ourselves out of this hole, and that's the way we're going to do it. And that growth has not happened, and is not happening, and is not materializing. And even just, you know, even these structural reforms that are going to work through the economy very, very slowly might not deliver that growth. So in the meantime, we've got basic kind of breakdown of in society, increasing numbers of violent and crimes, mob violence on the increase, and all of those sorts of things. So I don't know how much time there is to wait for to get this growth going. So basically, my question is, you know, you might say, yeah, we're gonna get growth, but are we going to get growth? And in the interim, what happens?
Look, I think South Africa is in deep. Your question's a very valid one. I think the country is in deep, deep trouble. On the one hand, we're not getting the growth or employment we desperately need. And of course, it would take time, even if we were the urgency and seriousness that it deserves. On the other hand, we're saying if you do start just spending money, we're going to have all sorts of other problems and complications. My view is, so that's all true. I don't think we can continue with the current approach that the president seems to be adopting, which is sort of more of the same. And yes, he's using Operation Vulindlela to try and move some things on his reform list to go faster, but that's not sufficient. There are many cabinet ministers and I'm sure senior officials who are just not up to the job. So I do think we're in a national emergency, and I do think we have to have a much more determined and serious approach to changing things up so we get some of the best people in the country actually trying to solve some things. And you could eliminate a whole lot of regulations very fast that could have a quicker impact, but we're not doing that and we're not going to do that. So I am arguing that the current approach is disastrous, and I don't think we're nearly serious enough about getting growth. We're certainly not serious enough about getting much more labor-intensive growth. We have failed to deliver any significant infrastructure projects and the growth related to that since 2018. It's time for a different approach, but more of the same. You end up with people saying, let's spend more money to help the poor, which will cause enormous problems of its own and probably end up with the country in a worse state, which is what we're arguing today. Or you have, as you're saying, but we're not getting growth and we're certainly not getting the jobs. But there are a lot of ideas of things to do and things not to do that could be adopted very quickly if there was real urgency in government and a real appreciation of the absolutely horrific circumstances in which people are living and with no hope for the future. But I don't think a big and spending on a big is going to help us. So I am calling for much more radical reform, if you like, than where we are now. It's the only thing I've got, Carol. I don't think there is more than that.
If I could just come back and say, you know, the one thing this government does do well is distribute grant money. It's a great success. They do it very well.
That's true. The grant money is well targeted from all we know, and it does well. And I'd certainly trust individual South Africans to spend their money better than the current civil service, without doubt, as a generalization. But, you know, you can think about this differently. You could say, we don't have the money. And anyone who looks at the cuts that have already been made over the last 3 years and intensifying and predicted for the next 3 years, we're cutting basic education. We're cutting money to policing. We're cutting all sorts of things that benefit the poor as well. So make no mistake, we're already in a fiscally, I don't know what to call it. Let's call it a fiscal, moving towards a fiscal crisis, which isn't an event, but a process. We're already there. And it's the poor that suffer the most from most of those cuts. So I think we're in a very difficult situation, but saying that we're just going to hand out money could lead to the situation Sri Lanka's in and worse. So I do think we're in a terrible situation on all fronts, but I think that a better bet would be the political risks of taking the very bold decisions of changing the cabinet to put competent people, not corrupt, and who actually know how to manage system change into the cabinet in key portfolios, and to taking the political risks of that. That's where we are now. I think that's a much better risk than hoping we can spend money, change, tell the Reserve Bank to change policy, say to investors and everyone in the country and elsewhere who might risk their money, we're changing our policy fundamentally, and we're no longer interested in protecting the value of the currency through sort of lowering inflation. I think it's a bad bet. Any other journalists who want to come ask questions? Or Carol, if you want to come back, you got a better idea?
Yeah, I don't have a better idea. I mean, I've consistently argued against the big, but yeah, I think that we're going nowhere with this reform. So for me, it's not even a case of like, should we have a big? It's like, well, is this government capable of running a modern economy? Clearly, the answer is no.
Is my answer. No, is my answer. I think people should be saying that with more often and more boldly, but no. And that's why I'm saying business as usual, in the sense of government as usual, is totally insufficient to the crisis that we're in. And that's the conversation the country should be having. And I think we're paralyzed at the moment. And of course, the poor suffer the most. That's the terrible situation that we're in. Anyone else who wants to, any other journalists who want to raise some questions or issues, please read our document, everyone. It's really worth reading. I've just given you a brief summary today, but the document, I think, has changed a number of people's minds, of the few people who've read it already, and I strongly recommend that you do that as well. But this is the conversation South Africa should be having. How do we deal with the crisis on every front? Think of Durban. We're just saying to Durban, which was subject to the July riots last year, to floods, oh, well, somehow we'll keep governing as usual. I don't believe it. I don't think anyone believes that will have the impact that's required. And that's just one example. But I think the first thing is real recognition of the very difficult, deep hole we have dug, and then an honest debate about what has to happen next. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to close the launch of this new report now. Thank you.